No, Ethan Ravenscroft said behind the half-closed door. Emily was never my first choice. The silver brooch slipped from Emily Carter's fingers and struck the marble floor with a sound far too small for the way her heart broke. She stood frozen in the moonlit corridor, holding the ceremonial cloak she had spent 6 months sewing by hand. 2 silver wolves curved across the dark blue fabric, their heads bowed beneath a single crown. Tonight, before every alpha in the Silverpine Kingdom, Ethan was supposed to place that cloak around her shoulders and name her his Luna. Instead, she had just learned what she truly was. A second choice, a quiet replacement for the woman he had once loved. Inside the royal study, Chancellor Richard Hale lowered his voice, but Emily could still hear him. Then why announce her tonight? Why bind the kingdom to an Omega when Victoria Ashbourne was everything the court expected? A long silence followed. Emily pressed her palm against the cold stone wall, trying to steady herself. She should leave. She should not listen. But 3 years of hope held her there like invisible chains. 3 years of tending Ethan's sleepless nights, easing the storms that haunted his wolf, and standing beside him when the crown felt heavier than any man should bear. She had never asked him to forget Victoria. She had only prayed that one day he might look at her without seeing the shadow of someone else. Emily has been loyal, Ethan said at last. His voice was calm, measured, unmistakably royal. She has given this kingdom more than anyone realizes. Loyal. The word cut deeper than cruelty would have. A trusted healer could be loyal. A devoted servant could be loyal. But a woman about to become his Luna should have been loved. Emily lowered her gaze to the cloak in her arms. Every stitch suddenly felt foolish. She remembered Ethan standing behind her the previous winter as snow covered the palace courtyard, his hand resting gently over hers while they watched children from the village skate across the frozen pond. She had believed the quiet between them meant peace. Now she wondered whether it had only meant absence. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in courage and destiny, hit like and subscribe. These stories remind us, love finds the broken. Now, back to Emily. Footsteps sounded inside the study. Emily gathered the cloak against her chest and moved before the door could open. She did not run. She would not give the palace walls the satisfaction of seeing her flee. She walked past the portraits of queens who had been chosen with certainty, past servants carrying candles toward the great hall, and past the tall windows where the first winter snow drifted over Silverpine. Behind her, the study door opened. Emily, Ethan called. She did not turn. For the first time in 3 years, the Alpha King's voice held no power over her. The silver brooch remained on the floor between them, shining beneath the moonlight like a promise that had already been broken. Emily did not stop until the corridor curved beyond Ethan's sight. Only then did her steps slow. The cloak weighed against her arms as though the silver thread had turned to iron. She kept her eyes forward, passing servants who bowed without noticing the way her fingers trembled. 3 years of memories followed her through the palace. The first came from a winter night when Ethan had returned from the northern border exhausted and silent. He had refused every healer until Emily entered his chamber with warm tea and a calm voice. She had not asked him what happened. She had simply sat beside the fire until the tension left his shoulders. Before dawn, he had fallen asleep in the chair, one hand resting near hers. Emily had carried that moment like a secret promise. Now it felt like something she had invented. She reached the narrow staircase leading to her rooms and climbed slowly. Outside, bells began to ring across Silverpine, announcing that the Luna ceremony would begin in 1 hour. Each sound traveled through the stone walls and settled inside her chest. In her room, candles glowed along the mantel. Her pale blue gown waited near the window, pressed and ready. A small velvet box sat beside it. Inside was the moonstone pendant Ethan had given her on her 27th birthday. He had fastened it around her neck himself and told her it belonged where he could see it. She had mistaken possession for devotion. Emily placed the ceremonial cloak across the bed and opened the box. Her reflection looked back from the mirror, composed and almost unfamiliar. She remembered another night, 8 months earlier, when Ethan had awakened from a dream calling Victoria's name. He had looked ashamed when he saw Emily beside him. She had touched his hand and told him grief did not make him disloyal. He had said nothing, but his fingers had closed around hers. Emily had convinced herself that silence meant gratitude too deep for words. Perhaps it had only meant he did not know how to tell her the truth. A soft knock came at the door. "Lady Emily?" It was Nora. The young maid assigned to help her prepare. "The court is gathering." Emily took one careful breath. "Come in." Nora entered carrying white roses, then stopped when she saw the untouched gown. "Is something wrong?" Emily looked at the flowers. Ethan had remembered that she preferred simple blooms to the jeweled arrangements favored by the court. The tenderness of that detail nearly undid her. "Nothing is wrong," she said softly. "I only need a little time." Nora hesitated, then set the roses down and left. When the door closed, Emily removed the moonstone pendant and placed it beside the silver brooch she no longer had. She had spent 3 years believing patience could turn borrowed affection into love. She had offered kindness without asking for certainty. She had waited while Ethan's heart remained somewhere behind him, tied to a woman the kingdom mourned. But Emily could not stand before the court and accept a crown meant for someone else. She folded her hands over the cloak and finally allowed one tear to fall. Then she wiped it away. By the time the bells rang again, the woman in the mirror no longer looked like someone waiting to be chosen. When the final bell sounded, Emily opened her chamber door and stepped into the corridor wearing the pale blue gown, but the ceremonial cloak was folded over her arms instead of resting on her shoulders. Nora waited outside with 2 attendants, and relief brightened her face until she noticed Emily's expression. "Lady Emily, the court is ready." Emily gave her a gentle smile. Then they should not be kept waiting. The walk to the great hall felt longer than ever before. Music drifted through the palace, warm and elegant, while hundreds of voices gathered beyond the carved oak doors. Every candle had been lit for her. Every noble family in Silverpine had come to watch Ethan choose his Luna. Emily heard the doors open, and silence rolled across the hall. Ethan stood at the foot of the throne in formal black, a silver crown above his dark hair. His gaze found her immediately. For one fragile second, everything inside her remembered how it had once felt to be seen by him. Then she remembered his voice behind the study door. "Never my first choice." She walked down the center aisle without lowering her head. The court watched the unfastened cloak in her arms, confusion spreading from one face to another. Chancellor Richard Hale stood near the royal council, his expression carefully blank. Emily wondered whether he had known she was listening. She wondered whether it mattered. Ethan stepped forward when she reached the dais. "Emily," he said quietly, "where is your brooch?" "On the floor outside your study." Something shifted in his eyes. "You were there." She did not answer. The truth already stood between them. The priestess lifted the silver circlet prepared for the ceremony, but Emily raised one hand. "Please stop." A breath moved through the room. Ethan came down one step. "We can speak privately. We have had 3 years for private words." Her voice did not rise, yet it carried beneath the vaulted ceiling. She placed the folded cloak on the lowest step of the throne. The silver wolves caught the candlelight, beautiful and unfinished. "This kingdom deserves a queen who is chosen without hesitation." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You do not understand what you heard." "I understand enough." Her heart pounded, but her hands were steady. "I will not stand beside a man while wondering whether he is looking past me towards someone he wanted more." The priestess lowered the circlet. No one moved. Emily could feel the court judging her, an Omega refusing the highest honor in the realm, but shame no longer belonged to her. She looked at Ethan one final time. Beneath the crown, he appeared less like a king than a man who had never imagined she might leave. "Your kingdom deserves a Luna," she said. "I deserve to be more than a replacement." Then she turned. "Emily, stop." The command struck the room with enough authority to make every wolf lower their gaze. Emily continued walking. Ethan could command armies, councils, and every noble house in Silverpine. He could not command her to surrender what remained of her dignity. The oak doors opened before her, revealing the dark corridor beyond. As they closed behind her, the music did not begin again. The doors had barely closed behind Emily when a new sound rolled through the great hall, not music, but the distant thunder of carriage wheels crossing the stone courtyard. Ethan remained at the foot of the throne, staring at the place where she had disappeared. The folded cloak rested below him, its silver wolves gleaming beneath the candles. No one spoke. Even Chancellor Richard Hale seemed careful not to breathe too loudly. Ethan descended the final step and picked up the cloak with both hands. The stitching was precise, every thread placed with the patience Emily brought to everything she touched. He remembered finding her asleep beside the embroidery frame 1 month earlier, her cheek resting against her folded arm while moonlight covered the unfinished crown. He had lifted a blanket over her shoulders and left without waking her. At the time, he had believed that quiet act was enough. Now the empty aisle told him otherwise. "Clear the hall," he said. The nobles bowed and began moving toward the exits, their whispers following them like dry leaves. Richard approached once the last guests had gone. "Your Majesty, perhaps this is for the best." The court was never comfortable with an Omega taking the crown. Ethan turned slowly. "Leave." Richard lowered his head. "Of course." Before he could reach the doors, a royal guard entered from the courtyard, his face pale with surprise. "Your Majesty, a carriage has arrived under the Ashbourne crest." Ethan went still. That crest had not crossed Silverpine's gates in 7 years. The guard stepped aside, and the great doors opened again. A woman stood beneath the archway in a deep green traveling cloak. Her golden hair was pinned back, though several strands had escaped during the journey. She looked older than the portrait preserved in Ethan's private study, but the gray eyes were the same. The eyes he had mourned. The eyes he had once believed he would never see again. "Victoria," he whispered. Her expression trembled between relief and uncertainty. "Hello, Ethan." The name crossed the hall and carried him backward to a time before the war, before the crown, before grief had settled into every quiet place inside him. Richard stopped near the doorway and lowered his gaze, hiding the satisfaction in his face. Victoria took one careful step forward. "I know they told you I was gone. I believed I would never return." Ethan should have moved toward her. For years, he had imagined this impossible moment. He had pictured the shock, the joy, the answer to every regret he had buried. Instead, his first thought was of Emily walking alone through the palace. His eyes dropped to the cloak in his hands. Victoria followed his gaze. "What is that?" Ethan could not answer. Beyond the tall windows, a small carriage passed through the eastern gate and disappeared into the falling snow. Emily sat inside with one travel bag at her feet and her hands folded tightly in her lap. She did not know who had arrived at the palace. She only knew that staying would cost her more than leaving. Back in the great hall, Victoria moved closer to the man who had once promised her his future. Ethan looked at the woman he had believed was his first choice, and for the first time, the memory of her felt farther away than the Omega who had just walked out of his life. By sunrise, every corridor in Silverpine Palace carried Victoria Ashbourne's name. Servants whispered that the lost daughter of the Western houses had returned. Nobles who had left the failed Luna ceremony in stunned silence came back wearing their finest coats, eager to witness what they called the restoration of fate. Ethan heard them from behind the closed doors of the council chamber, but the words gave him no comfort. Victoria sat across from him beside the fire, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she had barely touched. She told him about the remote estate where she had been kept after the war, about letters that never reached Silverpine, and about years spent believing the kingdom had forgotten her. Ethan listened carefully. He asked every question a king should ask. Yet whenever the room fell quiet, he noticed what Victoria did not ask. She did not ask why the Luna cloak remained folded beside him. She did not ask who had embroidered it. Emily would have noticed before sitting down. Emily noticed everything. "You are different," Victoria said at last. Ethan looked toward the winter light beyond the windows. 7 years changes people. It does not have to change what we were. Once, those words would have answered every prayer he had carried. Now they sounded like an invitation to return to a life that no longer existed. Later that afternoon, Victoria joined him in the palace conservatory, where white roses bloomed beneath the glass ceiling. She remembered that he once preferred red roses and ordered the gardeners to replace them. Ethan stopped her. "The white ones stay." Victoria studied him. "You never liked them." "Emily does." Her name entered the room like warmth leaving an open door. Victoria's expression softened with understanding. "The Omega from last night." Ethan's shoulders tightened. "Her name is Emily Carter. Do you love her?" He had faced councils, border disputes, and decisions that affected thousands of lives, but that simple question left him silent. Victoria stepped closer, not unkindly. "You used to answer me without thinking." That was true. The young man, Ethan, had been loved Victoria with the certainty of someone who had never lost anything. The man he had become knew that love could be quieter. It could look like tea waiting beside an unfinished report, a steady hand during a restless night, or white roses left untouched because someone understood that beauty did not need to be rearranged. That evening, Ethan entered his private rooms and felt Emily's absence in every corner. Her book no longer rested beside the hearth. The blue shawl she wore on cold mornings was gone from the chair. Even the room seemed unfamiliar without the faint scent of lavender she carried from the healing rooms. He opened the drawer where she kept the moonstone pendant and found it lying alone inside its velvet box. Beneath it was a small card in her careful handwriting. "Thank you for the kindness you were able to give." Ethan lowered himself into the chair and closed his hand around the pendant. He had his first choice back inside the palace. Yet the only woman he wanted to find was already miles beyond its gates. 3 weeks after leaving Silver Pine, Emily stood beside a narrow bed in the Frost Hollow clinic, listening to a child breathe. Snow pressed softly against the windows, whitening the rooftops of the small border village and covering the pine road that had brought her there. The boy beneath the wool blanket was 9 years old, the son of a respected alpha family, yet the village healers had refused to let Emily near him when she first arrived. An Omega was permitted to carry water, wash linens, and comfort frightened families. She was not permitted to diagnose illness or prepare medicine. Emily had listened without arguing. Then the boy's fever had risen, and his mother had taken Emily's hand. "Please," she whispered. "I do not care what the law says." Emily worked through the night with cool cloths, willow bark tea, and the quiet patience that had once calmed a king. By morning, the boy opened his eyes and asked for breakfast. Word traveled quickly through Frost Hollow. The same villagers who had watched Emily with suspicion now left bread, firewood, and jars of honey outside the small cottage she rented near the clinic. They did not call her Lady Emily. They called her Healer. The name felt honest. It belonged to something she had earned rather than something a man might place upon her shoulders. Still, when darkness settled and the village grew quiet, memories found her. She would reach for a second cup before remembering Ethan was not there. She would hear a deep voice in the wind and turn before she could stop herself. Leaving him had protected her dignity, but it had not erased her love. That was the cruelest part. 200 miles away, Ethan sat at the head of the Silver Pine Council table while Chancellor Richard Hale read the border laws aloud. Only ranked healers from recognized alpha or beta houses may practice independently, Richard said. The restriction protects the public. Ethan looked down at the report from Frost Hollow. A 9-year-old boy had recovered after every approved healer failed. At the bottom of the page, the village elder had written Emily Carter's name. "It protects privilege," Ethan said. Richard's expression tightened. "Your Majesty, the law has stood for generations. Then generations have been wrong." Ethan ordered the restriction suspended before sunset. He wanted to leave for Frost Hollow that same hour. His wolf pressed restlessly beneath his skin, urging him toward her, but Ethan remained in the palace. Emily had spent years arranging her life around his needs. He would not arrive at her door simply because he could no longer bear his own emptiness. Instead, he signed decrees allowing Omegas to train, heal, own property, and hold positions within village councils. He opened the palace records and saw, for the first time, how many quiet cruelties his kingdom had called tradition. In Frost Hollow, Emily received the royal decree beneath a gray morning sky. The elder read it twice, disbelief warming his weathered face. At the bottom was Ethan's seal and a handwritten line meant only for her. "You should never have needed my permission to become what you already were." Emily traced the ink with one finger. She did not forgive him. Not yet. But for the first time since leaving, she wondered whether the man behind the crown had finally begun to see. The first warning reached Frost Hollow just before noon, carried by a rider whose horse was white with snow. Emily stood outside the clinic as the village elder unfolded a sealed message from the western houses. Chancellor Richard Hale had declared Ethan unfit to rule, claiming the king had abandoned tradition and weakened Silverpine by granting power to Omegas. Several noble families had already pledged themselves to Richard, and Victoria Ashbourne's name appeared at the bottom of the declaration as proof that the old bloodline supported him. Emily read the page twice. Something about the signature felt wrong. Victoria had returned to reclaim a lost life, not to begin a rebellion. Before Emily could voice the thought, a second rider appeared at the edge of the village. This one wore no royal colors. A woman sat beneath a gray traveling cloak, her golden hair loose around a face pale from cold and exhaustion. Victoria nearly slipped as she dismounted. Emily reached her before anyone else. "You should not be here," Emily said. Victoria gave a breathless laugh. "For once, we agree." Inside the clinic, Emily wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and placed warm tea in her hands. Victoria stared at the steam as if gathering enough courage to speak. "Richard arranged my return," she said. "He knew where I had been for years. He kept my letters from Ethan and waited until the moment my presence could cause the most damage." Emily felt the room narrow around her. "Why?" "Because he believed Ethan would choose the past over you. He wanted the kingdom divided, and he wanted me beside him as a symbol the noble houses would obey." Victoria looked up. "When Ethan changed the laws, Richard lost control of the council. Now he intends to make Frost Hollow an example." Outside, village bells began to ring. Families moved quickly through the streets, closing shops and gathering children indoors. There was no panic, only the quiet fear of people accustomed to being forgotten by powerful men. Emily walked to the window. "How much time do we have?" "Not enough." Victoria rose too quickly and caught the edge of the table. Emily steadied her. A dark stain marked the side of Victoria's cloak where she had fallen during the journey, though the injury beneath was shallow. "Sit down," Emily said. Victoria stared at her. "After everything, you are going to help me?" Emily guided her back into the chair. "You were not the one who made me feel second." The words were soft, but they filled the room. Victoria's composure broke, not into tears, but into honest shame. "I thought I wanted him back," she admitted. "Then I saw the way he searched every doorway for you. I knew I had returned to a place that no longer belonged to me." Emily cleaned the scrape and tied a fresh bandage around Victoria's side. Beyond the clinic walls, the sound of approaching carriages traveled across the frozen road. Victoria caught Emily's wrist. "Richard does not want Ethan to choose between you and the crown. He wants the kingdom to watch him fail at both." Emily looked toward the northern ridge, where dark banners had appeared against the snow. Then another sound rose from the opposite road, deeper and steadier. Royal bells. Ethan was coming. Royal bells rolled across Frost Hollow as Ethan's carriage stopped at the village square. He stepped into the snow without waiting for a servant, dressed in a dark wool coat with the silver crown resting above his brow. Behind him came 6 council witnesses, not soldiers, each carrying sealed records from Silverpine. Richard Hale stood beneath the black banners on the northern road, surrounded by nobles who had mistaken tradition for loyalty. He smiled when Ethan approached. "You came quickly, Your Majesty." Ethan's gaze moved past him and found Emily outside the clinic. For one suspended moment, the village disappeared. She stood in a plain gray dress, her hair pulled back, one hand resting near Victoria's shoulder. She looked stronger than she had in the palace, not because the hurt was gone, but because she no longer needed to hide it. Ethan wanted to cross the square. He did not. Richard raised his voice so every family gathered along the storefronts could hear. "The council must decide whether a king who places an omega above the laws of his ancestors may continue to rule. Those laws denied capable people the right to serve their own communities," Ethan replied. "Changing injustice is not weakness." "And what of the crown?" Richard gestured toward Emily. "Will you surrender Silverpine for her?" Murmurs moved through the square. Emily felt every eye turned toward her, reducing her once again to a choice between a woman and a kingdom. Ethan reached up slowly and removed the crown. The movement silenced everyone. He crossed the snow and placed it on the wooden table before the council witnesses. "Emily was not my first choice," he said. The honesty struck her harder than any polished denial could have. Ethan looked directly at her. "She became the first choice I ever made with my heart." Richard's smile vanished. Ethan continued, his voice steady. "I will not keep a throne that requires me to call dignity rebellion or kindness weakness. If Silverpine wants such a king, choose another." One of the witnesses broke the first seal. "The council has reviewed Chancellor Hale's private correspondence." Richard turned sharply. Victoria stepped forward from the clinic, holding a bundle of letters against her cloak. "He kept these from Ethan for 7 years," she said. Then he used my return to divide the kingdom. The witnesses opened the records one by one. They contained Richard's orders, false signatures, and promises of power to the Western houses. No one shouted. No one needed to. The truth changed the air more completely than anger ever could. Richard's supporters lowered their banners. The village elder approached the table and placed Ethan's crown beside the evidence. Silverpine does not need a perfect king, he said. It needs one willing to become better. Ethan did not reach for the crown. His eyes remained on Emily. I did not come to ask you to return, he said. I came because you deserve to see me choose correctly, even if your answer is still no. Emily's throat tightened. Part of her had imagined this moment during lonely nights, but imagination had never included the humility in his face. You changed the laws, she said. Not for forgiveness, Ethan answered. Because they were wrong. Snow settled on his shoulders as the council restored his authority and ordered Richard removed from office. Still, Ethan left the crown on the table. He waited for no reward, no embrace, no promise. Emily looked at the man who had once expected her loyalty without giving her certainty. For the first time, he stood before her with nothing to command and nothing to hide. She stepped closer, but stopped an arm's length away. This does not repair everything. I know, and I am not ready to come back. Pain crossed his face, followed by acceptance. Then I will not ask. Emily watched him turn toward the villagers, ready to begin the work he had promised. The crown remained between them, untouched, while something quieter than forgiveness began to take root. Winter released Frost Hollow slowly. Snow withdrew from the roads. The creek began to move beneath thinning ice, and the clinic windows opened for the first time in months. Ethan remained in the village through all of it. He did not stay in the manor prepared for visiting royalty. He rented a plain room above the bakery and rose before sunrise to help carry supplies, repair fences, and listen to families whose names had never reached the palace. He returned to Silverpine only when the council required his presence, and each time he came back without banners or ceremony. Emily watched the change without pretending it erased the past. Trust did not return because a king lowered his crown. It returned in smaller ways. Ethan asked before entering the clinic. He listened when she disagreed. He never used duty, destiny, or the bond between their wolves to pressure her. When the Spring Council approved permanent rights for Omegas to practice medicine, own land, and hold public office, Ethan sent Emily the signed decree without a personal note. He understood that the law belonged to the people, not to his apology. Victoria returned to the Western houses and opened the hidden correspondence that cleared the names of families Richard had deceived. Before leaving Frost Hollow, she embraced Emily and whispered, "He loved the memory of me. He loves the truth of you." Emily carried those words quietly, neither accepting nor rejecting them. By the first moon festival of winter, nearly 1 year had passed since she had left the palace. Frost Hollow gathered beneath strings of lanterns that crossed the village square. Children ran between tables of warm cider and apple pies, while musicians played near the frozen creek. Ethan stood among the villagers in a dark coat, without his crown. He had stopped wearing it in Frost Hollow because he wanted them to speak to him as a man before they bowed to him as a king. Emily found him beside the wooden table where he had surrendered it months earlier. "You are leaving tomorrow," she said. "The council meets at Silverpine. I will return when the road's clear." There was no request hidden in his answer. That mattered more than she expected. Ethan looked toward the lanterns. "I cannot change the fact that you were not my first choice." Emily felt the old ache, softer now, but still real. He continued, "I can only spend the rest of my life making certain you never feel second again. Words once made me stay too long," she said. "Then judge me by what I do." He held her gaze without reaching for her. Emily thought of the laws he had changed, the months he had spent listening, and the mornings she had seen him carrying medicine through the snow without knowing she watched from the clinic window. Forgiveness had not arrived like thunder. It had grown quietly, through choices repeated until they became character. Music rose across the square. Ethan stepped back, giving her room to leave. Instead, Emily extended her hand. His breath caught, but he did not move until she nodded. Then his fingers closed gently around hers. The villagers fell silent as Ethan lowered himself to one knee, not before an Omega, a healer, or a future Luna, but before Emily. She touched the place above his heart. This time, Choose me before the crown. Ethan looked up at her, his eyes clear beneath the winter moon. Every time, Emily smiled and drew him to his feet. She did not return to the life they had lost. Together, they stepped toward a future neither of them would ever again mistake for second best.